Thank you very much for accepting my proposal for this seminar today. I'm very happy to have this chance to present my work in this Polish context. As you said, I will be talking about lesson study and its transposition to Italy, especially the cultural challenges that are connected to this issue. First of all, I would like to present myself. So once again, my name is Riccardo. I'm a PhD student at the University of Turin. I'm also a teacher educator and a mathematics teacher. My research focus is teachers' professional development in collaborative contexts. And my supervisor is here, this Professor Larbuti from the University of Turin, while my co-supervisor is Takeshi Miyakawa, Professor Takeshi Miyakawa from Waseda University in Japan. So I don't know if you had the chance to read the abstract, but this is the plan for the presentation. So we will start to introduce what is lesson study. We will speak about the role of culture in professional development. We will briefly introduce the Japanese and Italian institutional contexts. We will see some data from an experiment of lesson study that we did with prospective teachers and discuss some of the results and the future perspectives coming from this data. So I think that we can now start by introducing what lesson study is, and I would like to do it by showing you a short video. Yep, now you can see. これ虫クイザーのね四角のところなんだけど、ちょっと今からねどんな虫クイザーがここにこう作ってみますから。じゃあ。The lesson study was carried out a week later. As I was saying, when I first saw the video, I was very, very surprised because in the Italian context, thinking about having people other than the students and the teachers that it is conducting the lesson is very strange. So my first thought was, what are these other teachers doing when another one is already teaching? So what are they doing there? They are observing with the goal of discussing the efficacy of the lesson that they have built together. This is lesson study, and maybe together is a key difference from what we can find in other contexts. We will speak about that. So, what is lesson study? Lesson study is a collaborative model for teachers' professional development that happens inside the school, usually. It is usually modeled as a cycle, and a small group of teachers formulate a study theme of common interest, usually around a topic that they need to teach in the classroom. This group of teachers, which is usually made of 4 to 5 teachers, not much more, collaborative plan what we call a research lesson. So they prepare one topic, they choose one lesson from this topic, and they plan it together. One of these teachers is elected as implementing teachers, meaning that they will be the person that teaches the lesson to their own pupil in their own classroom. While in the meantime, other members of the group observe the lesson. In the end, the members of the group discuss and reflect on the data that they collected during the observation and eventually decide if it is the case or not to revise the lesson to improve it. But the main point is not the revision of the lesson, is to study together. Eventually, the cycle can be repeated multiple times, but as I was saying, the idea is of sharing the burden of lesson planning between colleagues while also learning from each other's experience. Lesson study is a professional development model, as I was saying, that is rooted in the history of Japan. It first developed when, in an effort of modernization from the Emperor Mutsuhito, what we call the Meiji Restoration, after many, many years of Japan being isolated from the rest of the world, Japan decided to move towards, for example, public schooling in an effort to modernize the social structure. So Japan needed new teachers. They opened teacher school, normal schools. But they had so much need for teachers that at one point these teachers learned how to teach themselves, peer learning. Interestingly, this happened when a book from the Western scholars Pestalozzi about peer education methods arrived, was imported to Japan. What we see at work in this case is a peculiar trait of the Japanese culture. It often happens that they find something from the West, they englobate it into their own culture, and it looks like as if that thing that came from the West was actually always part of the Japanese culture. So after this first start in Japan, after about 20, 25 years, lesson study also migrated to China and Korea. And in fact, right now it is a professional development model that is very used also in these two countries and in general in the eastern part of the world. And about 1 century later, it also reached the whole world after one of the first comparative studies, the TEAM studies of 1999. Since then, a lot of literature has been produced on lesson study. And what we see here is just a very short list. What we can notice, what I can say to you about this list, is that especially at the beginning, lesson study was approached from the USA and the UK, mostly in the effort of taking lesson study out of Japan and planting it in the American or British context. From this list, only this article we can say that is really worried about the culture that surrounds lesson study. And in fact, this starting approach did not really work. There were many problems, cultural problems, because you can't really take something from one culture, taking somewhere else, and just hope that it will work. So after some time, we can see a shift in the focus from taking lesson study to actually understanding it. And this is also my line of work, hopefully. The main problem in this is that from a cultural point of view, the East and the West are profoundly different, are very different. In particular, in the West, we see theorizing in a very different way from how they see it in the West. For us, theorizing something is fundamental. This is because of our history, because of our language, and unfortunately, we cannot investigate this much more in this presentation because it is a very complicated topic. But in the end, what matters to us is that lesson study lacks, from our point of view, an original theoretical characterization. So we needed, and maybe we still need, to come up with a theorization of our own, but for something that comes from another culture. That is extremely difficult. So what I want to do is trying to take this lesson study from Japan, but not just take it. What I want to do is not migration of lesson study. It's not copy and paste of lesson study. It is something else, in an attempt to contribute to the general knowledge on lesson study. And hopefully, I would like to do it from a novel point of view. I tried to do it from a novel point of view. In fact, I had the chance of working not only with my Italian supervisor, but also with my Japanese co-supervisor, who spent a lot of time in Europe. And so he has a different kind of mindset from other Japanese colleagues. And I myself have been immersed, I would say, in the Japanese culture since I was a child. So this hopefully helped me to have a novel look on lesson study. And now we have to say a few words on the role of culture in my work. Thankfully, Professor Natalie Sinclair already broke the ice on the idea that mathematics is not culture-free. This happened 1 week ago, so if you could not attend the conference, I invite you to check the recordings on the YouTube channel. We have the link here, and it is available on the YouTube channel. It is dedicated to these seminars. The point that Professor Sinclair tried to make is that if mathematics is in many ways culture dependent, and so is the way we teach it, and this is what she said, what I want to take from that is that we can only expect that there is also something more than just the learning and the teaching. In fact, I expect that also the teacher education is influenced by culture and is not cultural dependent. In fact, in an education system, we can expect that culture contributes to the form of acceptable pedagogy, teacher interactions, classroom practice, and of course, teachers' professional development programs. And in fact, it has been a while since it has been recognized that the role of culture is a very important aspect of mathematics education. A small problem arises when we try to define culture. What is culture? Because, for example, we can say that culture is what gives identity to a diverse group of people, or that culture is a system of shared values and beliefs between people. But the fact is that there is no shared definition of culture, even if it is often linked with the concept of society and organization. This makes studying the influence of culture a bit difficult, as you can imagine. There is an entire branch of mathematics education research on the role of culture in mathematics, that is the ethnomathematics. We are not going to go that far in this presentation, and not even in my work in general. So to try to simplify things a little bit, I chose to rely on the notion of practice as a link between culture and the larger cultural context, and so trying to investigate practices. In particular, I chose to rely on the institutional perspective that is proposed by the anthropological theory of didactics that was proposed by Chevalard. In ATD, institution is any created reality of which people can be members, permanent or temporary. This means institution in a formal way, such schools, ministry, something else that can come to your mind, but also something that is not as formal, such as family, group of friends, something like that. The fact is that this institution provide people with conditions and constraints that shape their practices. And so the links that we said before, as practice as a link between culture and cultural context. Thanks to this perspective, we are actually able to investigate the cultural aspect of human practices. And one note about the theoretical aspect of this presentation. My goal today is not to show the theoretical implication of my work, but the educational outcomes. So I try to keep the theoretical framework as simple as possible. I won't go much more deeper than this, but ATD is a very rich theory. Okay, now we should say a few words on the Japanese and the institutional context related to school. What I want to remember here is that there is no amount of information that I can give to actually paint a really good picture of the Japanese or the Italian school systems. They are too complex. They would require a seminar for each of them to just give a proper outline. So forgive me if I'm not sure how much we will be able to understand from this information that I'm going to give you, but there is something that I need to say. So the Japanese school system is a 6 free systems, meaning 6 years of primary school, free of middle school, and free of high school, which is mandatory until 9th grade. They have non-inclusive classrooms, meaning that people with disabilities either attend special classes or special schools altogether. The school day is a huge part of the day for teachers and students. As for teachers, it starts from 8 to 5, 8 in the morning to 5 p.m. And for students is almost the same amount of time. And a large part of this time is dedicated to communal life within the school community. So it's not just lessons, but it's also students and teachers spending their time together. Students to learn, teachers to learn themselves, prepare lessons, for example. In this frame, professional development is not mandatory, even if almost every teacher participates in it. Professional development mostly happens during school hours. It is often organized by schools themselves in the school. It is financed by the school, the regional administrations, and the ministry. Classrooms are open to observers, as we saw in the video, and teachers also have shared spaces for discussion, both in a physical sense, but also in the sense of time. In their time in school, they have time to meet and discuss between themselves. The Italian system is a bit different. It's a 5-3-5 system, mandatory until 10th grade. We have inclusive classroom, so we do not differentiate students with disabilities. The school day is also quite different, as it can also be from 8 to 5, but the main difference is that students and teachers usually stay in school mainly for the lessons. Especially teachers, when they are not teaching lessons, they usually don't spend time in school because they really don't have much space for themselves there. In this framework, professional development is mandatory for the ministry, but is not heavily regulated. It takes place during non-school hours. Teachers have a quite big variety of professional development offers to adhere to, and they voluntarily decide where to go. Sadly, there is little financial support at both school level and administration level, sadly. And different from Japan, classrooms are teachers' private spaces, as I was saying. It's unusual for other teachers to attend lessons held by their colleagues. And also there is no or very little shared space for discussion, especially in middle school and secondary school. The situation in primary school is a bit different, but I won't be speaking about that. Another key difference between Italy and Japan is how the curriculum is structured. For example, as we can read in the slide and we can find from the encyclopedia produced by Teams 2015, the mathematics curriculum in Japan consists of 3 parts: overall objectives for the level, objective content for each grade, and syllabus design. Methods and material are specified to some extent, as well as in the construction of teaching plans and remarks on content. So you can see that the ministry has a, how would you say, high control on what happens in a mathematics classroom. On the contrary, in Italy, the situation is quite different, because teaching is influenced by Article 33 of our Constitution, which says that art and science are free, and so is their teaching. So the Ministry of Education publishes the Indicazioni Nazionali, which can be translated as national guidelines, which are a framework for schools in the design and implementation of local curricula. Schools are free to determine contents and methods of instructions autonomously, as long as they are consistent with the learning objectives of the Indicazioni Nazionali. So the situation is quite different. In Japan, the curriculum is very well designed from the ministry. In Italy, we have a framework in which schools and teachers are have this teaching freedom. The main point, what I mean to say, is that we have to remember that lesson study works in Japan because of the context, because of the synergies between context, institution, administration, and even media, since Japanese teachers often publish books and journals for their teachers. This is very rare in Italy. In fact, we need in Italy more collaboration. We need quality professional development, more quality professional development, because we have some. We need to work together on better ways to deliver the curriculum, for example. And there is an institutional request for all of this. And we think that lesson study could be one piece of the answer to all of these problems. So the goal of my work is to improve our understanding of lesson study. To do so, on the one hand, I study, as we said, the Japanese and Italian culture and institutions. And on the other hand, I experiment lesson study with prospective and practicing teachers. And in the second part of the presentation, we will focus on experiments with teachers. So, I'm going to present the first experiment that we did with lesson study in Turin. We worked with 29 teachers in pre-service training at the University of Turin. They were quite young, 22 to 24 years old. They had no real classroom experience because for example, differently from Poland, our teachers in training are not required to spend some time in the classroom before actually becoming teacher. We can speak a bit more about that later. It's a bit of a complicated system. These teachers were enrolled in the course Elementary Mathematics from an Advanced Standpoint, with the main mathematical topic of the course was continuous fractions. And of course, we must remember that we researchers acting as teacher educators, we were also part of the experiment, of this experimental setting. So our task as educators was to introduce lesson study to these teachers. We can say that we did this introduction by focusing a lot on the Japanese institutional context. And on the left, you can see one of 4 slides on this topic. This is specifically the history of lesson study, but there was something about the history of Japan and so on. And maybe too little on what lesson study actually is. So on the right, you can see the slide that actually describes the phases of lesson study. By the way, you will notice a difference from the picture that you see here, from the slide that you see here, and the picture that I used in the introduction. And this is because this division in phases of lesson study is not really this strict, and it can happen that phase 4 discussion and 5 reflection are just melted together, but that is not that important. In fact, the 5 phases that we saw in the previous slide for the teachers were merged, as you see here. In fact, the teachers were asked to study and design a teaching activity on continued fraction and write an activity report and a lesson plan for a 20 minutes mock lesson. I will come again in a minute on what is an activity report. Then they were asked to teach and observe this mock lesson in front of their peers and educators. And finally, they were asked to collaboratively discuss the efficacy of the lesson and individually reflect on the discussion. Now, in a few seconds, we are going to see an example of what an activity report is, but a few words on that, because I think that this is something quite specific of the Italian context for professional development. So activity reports are common document in our context for professional development. They usually describe teaching activities on a mathematical topic that are supposed to be carried out over a long time period, usually from 2, 3 to 12 hours of lessons in the classroom. They usually consist of a short introduction of the teaching activity itself, followed by the task or the tasks for the students, an extended description of the phases and materials of the teaching activity, and the corresponding teaching strategies. And then teachers are free to adapt these phases to their classroom context. The teachers were divided into 8 groups of 3 to 4 people, self-formed. And during this presentation, we will follow just one of them. In particular, we will follow the group number 1, made of Angela, Nadia, Enrico, and Marta. Of course, these are fictional names. And in particular, Nadia was the implementing teacher. Now, I would like you to at least catch a glimpse of the activity report that they produced. Sorry if I'm not showing it to you in a bigger way, but it is only in Italian, so we wouldn't really be able to understand it. The point is that, as you can see, this is a very detailed document. We have on the first page the short introduction. We have the 2 tasks. We have the description of the phases, the material, and the teaching strategies. Here, there were supposed to appear some highlighting. I don't know why they are not there. Sorry about that. Anyway, the activity is called Matryoshka fractions. It is thought for grade 11. And from what we can see, it is supposed to last at least 80 minutes. I say at least because now phases 1, 2, and 3 were timed, while phase 4 and 5 were not. So we don't know how long exactly they were thinking about it would last. We are going to focus on one of the tasks so that you can see the idea. In fact, the aim of the activity is to connect the process of dividing a rectangle into squares with the algebraic form of a continued fraction. So here, this first task that you can see, you have a triangle which is 45 times 16. You divide it into squares of sides 13. You are left with a smaller triangle, and you proceed in divide this triangle again. In particular, this task brings to a finite continuous fraction. There will be a second task, moreover, that produces an infinite one. And so this is supposed to connect these two representations, possible representation of a continuous fraction. As for the lesson plan for the 20-minute mock lesson that they were asked to produce, sadly we have none. They didn't write one, and in a little we will see some possible reasons why. But what they did is that, well, they did teach the mock lesson. And even here, there were some peculiarities. Because as I told you, the activity report is supposed to describe the tools for the activity. This one did. The report says that the activity used to use the blackboard, some paper, drawings on the blackboard, and we were we were expecting the teachers to at least stick to the activity report, even if they had written no lesson plan. But what happened is that during the lesson, Nadia used a matryoshka. Why? It was not there. And in fact, these tools that were in the lesson but not in activity report or vice versa happened with almost all groups. And in fact, if we look at the general results, we see some commonalities, like we see that no group actually wrote a lesson plan. So we tried to investigate what was going on. We administered an anonymous survey. And from this, what we found out was that the teachers were all convinced that they had produced a lesson plan, yet the word lesson almost never appeared in their answer. And when they referred to the mock lesson, they used the term activity. This left us quite perplexed. suggesting that there was some kind of overlap between two words, activity and lesson, that we considered pretty different from each other. Some of their answers gave us more hints on what was happening. For example, Nadia, I told you that the survey was anonymous, but here she refers to the Matryoshka, so we know that this is Nadia. She says that she chose to use the Matryoshka. She did not discuss this with the colleagues because the way of expressing the content of the lesson is very subjective and strongly depends on the teacher. I will also show another answer, which I believe is particularly significant. We have another teacher, we don't know who they are. They say, I like that there is collaboration between teachers for the creation of a common project to be presented to the students, but there must be flexibility in adapting the lesson to the class, according to the characteristics of the teachers. And this sentence is very strong. We are people and not machines. So here they are suggesting that the teachers, they perceive the idea of planning in a way similar to that of a cage, that they have to follow as machines this planning that they did together. This was also very surprising to us. We were not expecting this reaction. So at this point, as educators, we noticed that something was going wrong, and we decided to investigate it as researchers. The data that I'm going to show to you now come from our research notes as a research group. So, of course, we noticed that each group should have produced an activity report and a lesson plan for the lesson. However, all groups only produced an activity report with eventually a general indication of the time. So we wonder, how do we better communicate with the teachers? And in particular, has what is meaningful in the world of lesson study research the same meaning that it has in the teachers community? Because apparently that's not the case. So we decided, between all the problems that we had to deal with, that at the macro level, at least, we believe that there is the need to establish a shared language a priori, in particular concerning the terms lesson and activity. Not only this, we are going to see, but this one of the most important conclusions that we reached. So we held another lecture with the teachers. In this one, we examined the work that they had done until this point, and we explained more in details what lesson study is in our vision. Here, for example, you see one of the slides that we used for this second lecture to speak about how a lesson plan should be done. And this is also where we discussed our meaning of lesson, the meaning that this word has in lesson study. So 1 hour lesson that takes place in a classroom at a specific time. We're going to see in a second why this was necessary. Because when we asked to the teachers what they thought about their work after this second lecture, we got some encouraging results. In this case, the data are not anonymous, so it's like as we can speak directly to the members of group 1. For example, Nadia realized that the planning was insufficient and too much space was left to her personal initiative. And she recognizes that planning is the cornerstone of lesson study, as it forces one to consider a multitude of aspects that are often left aside and improvised during a normal lesson. Marta understands that lesson planning, as compared to activity design, is more linked to contextual aspects, such as the class to which the lesson is addressed, and so on. And Enrico says, we mixed up activity and lesson. This may be because we are used to having longer time for individual lessons, so we mix activities and lessons. And in fact, this is another difference between the Japanese and Italian context, which I didn't mention before. In Japan, usually lessons last 1 hour, and this hour is dedicated to one subject that is different from the previous one and the following one. while in Italy, a teacher can be in the same classroom for the same subject for up to 3 hours. Usually 2, usually it can be 1, 2, 3 is more rare, but it can happen. So it's a very big difference that we have not considered at all. So what are the results of this first experience with lesson study? What we saw here and what we see from the data are a number of features of lesson study that could be troublesome for the implementation of lesson study in Italy. In fact, the institutional differences between Italy and Japan determined at least 3 main problematic features. The first 2 are the most evident, this overlapping meaning of activity and lesson, the meaning of the lesson plan, and a more subtle one, the time planning. It is related to time planning. Well, what to say about this dual meaning of activity, this overlapping between activity and lesson? What we can say is that it's actually not very surprising that words are important. Terminology is a crucial cultural factor, and it can be something that prevents proper implementation of lesson study or other teachers' practices that are coming from another context. And here we have to note that cultural can also take a slightly different meaning from the one that we used before. Because even if in this experiment, educators and teachers are all Italian, so they all come from the same bigger culture, we have to remember that the educator's culture and the teacher's culture are different because they belong to different institutions. So they are subject to different constraints. About the lesson plan is a specific tool of lesson study, and its importance was not really understood during our experiment, because Italian teachers already have the activity reports, which play kind of a similar role, but it's not the same role. So we need to make explicit why we propose such a tool to the teachers. For instance, we believe that the lesson plan can allow teachers to be more aware of their educational choices and on the real classroom context in which they are working when they plan the lesson. And it can also be a tool to share, collaborate, and discuss the teaching with other colleagues, which now doesn't really happen. So we need to make this, our view, more explicit to the teachers, so they are more able to understand our intentions, something that they can't read our mind. We have to remember that. And in the Italian case, we also need to make clear that the lesson plan is not against their constitutional rights. It's not a rigid set of instructions that they have to follow. It's just a guide. And as you saw, in Italy, this is in no way a secondary aspect at all. I don't know about your context, but in Italy, this is something that we must be aware of. In relation to time planning, the data suggests that it could be very difficult for Italian teachers to time plan a single lesson in detail, as we saw, because they are not used to this kind of meticulous time planning. But we believe that interacting with the lesson study may force them to take other perspectives and pay attention to every moment of the lesson, which maybe sometimes they don't really do. What can we say about what happened after this experiment? Well, as researchers, we have to be aware that some of these problems and even other problems are beyond our capabilities or the teacher's capabilities. For example, other than some of the problems that we addressed before, we spoke about there is the lack of spaces in schools for discussion, or that the teachers spend very little time in school, which means that a lot of their work is unregulated and is done at home, which can be overwhelming for them. This suggests that we need to involve other institutional actors, such as headmasters or the ministry itself, which may not be this easy, but the results show that lesson study is good for the Italian context. So it is worth the effort. Fortunately, some misunderstandings are a bit easier to tackle. We can stress, for example, the difference between lesson and activity, which proved problematic for us at the beginning. For example, proposing a sort of hierarchy of the goals that teaching tries to reach. So there are the learning goals of the single lesson, there are the learning goals of the overall activities, and then there are the long-term learning goals. This can be an example. Or, well, we could provide a structure for a lesson plan, which in this case, if we provide the same structure to all the teachers, can also become a tool for the Italian community of lesson study, a common tool for discussion and for sharing, which is very important. Now, overall, as researchers and educators, I think that we can say that after this first experiment, and of course for the rest of our work, we are more aware of our role in communicating with the teachers about foreign practices. We feel that we have a toolbox of possible actions for the implementation of even other foreign practices. And we hope that with this knowledge, we can contribute to similar projects in other contexts. Now, this almost concludes the presentation. Here we have the list of references from this presentation. If you would like to know more on the topic, of course, I'm here, and I'm also available if you want to contact me via email. The email was in the title slide. I would like to end this with a question for you. This is the question: how do you see lesson study in your context? Sorry. And of course, thank you very much for listening.